Welcome back to another story on Infidelity Tales Lab. Before we begin, tell us, where in the world are you watching from? Now, let's dive into today's story. Chapter 1. The Perfect Life Shattered. Will Green had always believed that family was everything. At 38, he was the town's most respected defense attorney, known for his razor-sharp intellect and unwavering moral compass. His law office overlooked the courthouse where he'd won case after case, building a reputation that extended far beyond their small town of Cedar Falls. But Will's greatest pride wasn't his career, it was his family. His younger brother Gary had followed him into public service, becoming the town's sheriff at 35. Despite their different paths, the Green brothers were inseparable, having raised each other after their parents died in a car accident when Will was 16 and Gary just 13. Will's personal life seemed equally blessed. Melissa Dudley, the town's head librarian, had been his fiancée for 2 years. Their wedding was planned for spring, and Melissa had seamlessly integrated into the Green family. Will's 18-year-old son Brian, from his first marriage to his late wife Sarah, adored Melissa and had started calling her mom within months of their engagement. The first crack in Will's perfect world appeared on a Tuesday evening in October. He was working late, preparing for a high-profile case involving local businessman Manuel Farley, who was accused of insurance fraud. Will had taken the case pro bono, believing in Farley's innocence despite the mountain of circumstantial evidence. His phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Check your fiancé's computer. Password is Green 2025. Truth hurts. Will dismissed it as someone trying to sabotage his relationship, but curiosity gnawed at him. 3 days later, while Melissa was at her book club, he found himself sitting at her laptop. His hands trembled as he typed the password. What he found turned his world upside down. Encrypted files, financial records showing large cash deposits, and most damning of all, communications with someone identified only as AH. The messages detailed a plan to frame Manuel Farley, involving planted evidence and forged documents. The final message made Will's blood run cold. Phase 2 begins next week. Will Green goes down. His reputation will ensure no one believes his protests. Will spent the weekend in a daze, trying to process the betrayal. Melissa, the woman he loved, was not just cheating on him. She was part of a conspiracy to destroy him. But who was H? And why target him? The answer came Monday morning when FBI agents surrounded his office. The search warrant was signed by his own brother. Chapter 2. The Arrest. Will Green, you're under arrest for conspiracy to commit insurance fraud, tampering with evidence, and obstruction of justice. Agent Patrick Whitehead's voice was cold, professional. Will recognized him. They'd worked together on several cases over the years. This is ridiculous, Will said, maintaining his composure even as handcuffs clicked around his wrists. I'm the attorney defending against these charges, not perpetrating them. Evidence suggests otherwise, Whitehead replied grimly. We found forged documents in your office safe, along with $50,000 in cash that matches the serial numbers from Farley's missing insurance payout. Will's mind raced. He'd never seen that money before, and the documents Whitehead described were completely foreign to him. Someone had planted evidence in his own office, someone with access. The perp walk through the courthouse was a nightmare. Reporters shouted questions, cameras flashed, and Will saw the shock and betrayal in the faces of colleagues who'd respected him for years. But the worst moment came when they brought him to the county jail. Sheriff Gary Green stood waiting in the booking area, his face a mask of cold fury. Well, my big brother, the righteous attorney, turns out to be just another corrupt lawyer. Gary, you know me better than anyone, Will said desperately. I'm being framed. Someone planted that evidence. Gary's laugh was bitter. 23 years I've looked up to you, Will. 23 years of believing you were better than everyone else. And all this time, you've been as dirty as the criminals you defend. Listen to me. No, you listen. Gary leaned close, his voice dropping to a whisper. I've been investigating you for months. The gambling debts, the offshore accounts, the pattern of defending clients you know are guilty for the right price. Did you really think I wouldn't find out? Will stared at his brother in shock. What gambling debts? What offshore accounts? Gary, none of this is real. But Gary had already turned away, gesturing to the deputies. Process him like any other criminal, and make sure he gets the special treatment reserved for corrupt cops and lawyers. The cell door slammed shut with a finality that echoed through Will's bones. Rot in hell, scum, Gary spat before walking away. An hour later, Melissa arrived for visiting hours. Will felt a surge of hope. Surely she would stand by him, help him figure out who was behind this elaborate frame job. Instead, she looked at him with undisguised disgust. How would you do this to us, Will? To Brian? To your brother who's worked so hard to build an honest career? Melissa, please, I need you to listen. She cut him off with a sharp laugh. I found the statements, Will. The secret accounts, the payments from clients. Did you think I was stupid? Did you think I wouldn't eventually notice the expensive gifts, the cash you thought I didn't see? Will realized with growing horror that someone had fed her fabricated evidence too. Those aren't mine. Someone is setting me up. Stop lying. Melissa's voice rose, attracting the attention of other visitors. Then she did something that would haunt Will's dreams for months to come. She spat in his face. We're done, Will. Don't ever contact me again. As she walked away, her heels clicking on the concrete floor, Will felt his world completely collapse. Chapter 3. The Deepest Cut. The arraignment was scheduled for Friday, giving Will 4 days in jail to contemplate his destroyed life. His court-appointed lawyer was Bobby Larson, a decent but overworked public defender who clearly believed his client was guilty. The evidence is overwhelming, Larson said during their first meeting. Bank records, physical evidence, witness testimonies. Your best bet is to plead guilty and hope for a reduced sentence. I won't plead to crimes I didn't commit, Will said firmly. Someone orchestrated this entire thing. I need you to investigate. With what resources? Larson interrupted. Mr. Green, I have 37 other cases. Unless you can afford private counsel, which given your current situation, you obviously can't. You need to be realistic about your options. Will's last hope was his son. Brian had always been his anchor, the one pure thing in his life. Surely an 18-year-old wouldn't be fooled by whatever lies were being spread. Brian came to see him Thursday night, and Will nearly broke down at the sight of his boy's face, so much like his late mother's, but twisted with anger and disappointment. I changed my name, Brian said without preamble. It's Brian Dudley now. Melissa helped me with the paperwork. The words hit Will like physical blows. Son, please, don't call me that. Brian's voice was flat, emotionless. I don't have a father anymore. Sarah Dudley. Mom, she's more family to me than you ever were. Brian, your mother is dead. Her name was Sarah Green, and Melissa isn't. My mother is Melissa. She's been taking care of me since you've been too busy with your criminal enterprises to notice your own son. Brian leaned forward, and Will saw tears in his eyes, not of sadness, but of rage. How long have you been lying to me, Will? How long have you been stealing money while pretending to be this great man? Will realized that Brian had been fed the same fabricated evidence as everyone else, possibly for weeks or months. The manipulation was too sophisticated, too complete. Someone had planned this down to the smallest detail. I know this looks bad. It doesn't look bad. It is bad. Brian stood up. The man who raised me was a lie. You're a lie. I never want to see you again. As his son walked away, Will felt something break inside him that he wasn't sure could ever be repaired. At the arraignment, Will stood before Judge Christian Cameron, a man he'd known and respected for 15 years. The charges were read in a voice that seemed to echo from a great distance. Conspiracy, fraud, tampering with evidence, money laundering. How do you plead? Judge Cameron asked. Will looked out at the packed courtroom. Melissa sat in the front row next to Brian, both wearing expressions of disgust. Gary stood along the back wall in his sheriff's uniform, arms crossed. The town's elite, people Will had considered friends, whispered among themselves, their eyes full of judgment and betrayal. Not guilty, Will said, his voice carrying clearly through the courthouse. The judge set bail at $500,000, an impossible amount for someone whose assets had been frozen. As the deputies led him back to his cell, Will heard someone in the gallery mutter, They'll wish they were never born when the truth comes out. He turned to look, but couldn't identify the speaker among the sea of hostile faces. Still, those words lodged in his mind like a promise or a threat. That night, alone in his cell, Will Green began a plan. Chapter 4. The investigation begins. Prison had a way of clarifying the mind. After 3 weeks in county lockup, Will had moved past anger and grief into something far more dangerous. Cold, calculating fury. He used his time wisely, observing the guards, learning the routines, and most importantly, thinking. The frame job was too perfect, too comprehensive. Someone had access to his office, his personal information, and enough knowledge of his habits to plant evidence convincingly. More concerning was how quickly his family had turned against him. It suggested they'd been fed lies for months, maybe years. Will's breakthrough came when he noticed Deputy Kurt Oliver watching him with something that might have been sympathy. Oliver was young, maybe 25, and unlike the others, he didn't treat Will with open contempt. Oliver, Will called during evening rounds. Can I ask you something? The deputy glanced around nervously before approaching the cell. What? How long have you known Sheriff Green? Since I started 3 years ago. What? Has he always lived so well? Nice house, expensive truck, designer clothes for a sheriff's salary? Oliver's expression grew troubled. That's not really... his wife has money, right? From her family. Will felt his first surge of genuine hope in weeks. Deputy, my brother has never been married, and our family never had money. We grew up in foster care after our parents died. The seeds of doubt were planted. Over the following days, Will carefully shared more information with Oliver. Details about Gary's past that didn't match the official story everyone believed. He was careful not to push too hard, just giving the young deputy enough inconsistencies to start asking questions. Meanwhile, Will's own investigation continued. He used his one phone call each day strategically, reaching out to old contacts in the legal community. Most wouldn't take his calls, but a few remained loyal enough to listen. The picture that emerged was disturbing. His corruption had been whispered about for months before his arrest. Anonymous tips to the FBI suggesting they investigate his finances and client relationships. Someone had been methodically destroying his reputation long before the physical evidence was planted. His former paralegal, Janelle Childs, was one of the few who still believed in him. During their brief conversation, she revealed something crucial. Mr. Green, someone broke into the office 2 weeks before your arrest. Nothing was reported missing, but I noticed files had been moved around. The safe was open when I came in that morning, even though I was sure you'd locked it the night before. Did you tell the police? I told Sheriff Green. He said it was probably just you coming in early and forgetting to close it properly. Another piece of the puzzle. Gary had dismissed evidence of the break-in, probably because he'd orchestrated it himself. The most shocking revelation came from an unexpected source. Alejandro Herrera, a private investigator Will had used on several cases. Alejandro visited him in jail, claiming to have information about his case. Someone hired me 6 months ago to dig up dirt on you, Alejandro said quietly. Pay me $20,000 cash to find anything, gambling debts, affairs, financial problems. When I came up empty, they fired me. Who hired you? That's the thing. It was a woman. Professional, mid-40s, claimed to be a journalist. But something fell off. She knew too much about you. Too many personal details for a stranger. Will's mind raced. Can you describe her? Blonde, about 5 feet 6 inches, expensive clothes. Had a small scar on her left hand, right between the thumb and index finger. Will's blood turned to ice. He knew that scar intimately. Melissa had cut herself on a broken wine glass during their first Christmas together. But this meant she'd been planning his destruction for at least 6 months before his arrest. Chapter 5. Allies and Revelations. The breakthrough came when Deputy Oliver approached Will's cell with a troubled expression. Mr. Green, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be straight with me. Always. Your brother's living in a house worth $500,000. Drives a truck that costs more than my yearly salary. I looked into it. There's no rich wife, no family money. Where's it coming from? Will chose his words carefully. Kurt, what would you say if I told you that my brother has been taking bribes from local criminals for years? That he's been covering up crimes, and eliminating threats to his operation? I'd say that's a serious accusation. It's also the truth. And I think I was getting too close to evidence that would expose him. Oliver was quiet for a long moment. The Manuel Farley case. You were defending him against insurance fraud charges. Right. And I was winning. I had evidence that someone else had orchestrated the fraud and was using Farley as a scapegoat. Jesus, Oliver breathed. If you're right, I need your help, Kurt. But I understand if you can't. No, Oliver said firmly. If Sheriff Green is dirty, then he's making all of us look dirty. What do you need? Will's plan was risky, but it was his only shot. He needed Oliver to access evidence that had been conveniently overlooked during the investigation. More importantly, he needed someone on the outside who could start connecting the dots he'd begun to see. Oliver's first discovery was explosive. The $50,000 planted in Will's safe had been reported missing from evidence lockup 3 months earlier. The theft report had been filed and then mysteriously buried. The money was supposed to be evidence in a drug trafficking case that Gary's department had investigated. This is massive, Oliver said during their next conversation. If I'm reading this right, your brother stole money from evidence and used it to frame you. But Will had realized something even worse. Kurt, think about it. If Gary needed to frame me, it means I was a threat. What was I close to discovering? The answer came from an unexpected source. Louise Palmer, an inmate who'd been arrested 3 weeks before Will, had been bragging about his connections to law enforcement. Palmer was a small-time drug dealer who claimed he had insurance against prosecution. Your brother's been taking payments from the Herrera cartel for 2 years, Palmer told Will during a quiet moment in the yard. Protection for their operations, advance warning about raids, evidence tampering. Word is he's gotten greedy lately, demanding bigger cuts. How do you know this? Because I was part of it. I moved money for them through local businesses. Your brother launders his payments through the same system. Palmer grinned, showing gold teeth. But here's the interesting part. Someone's been asking questions about the sheriff's finances. Real detailed questions. Made the cartel nervous. Will felt pieces clicking into place. Someone was investigating Gary's corruption. They hired Alejandro Herrera to investigate me instead of him. Could be. All I know is the cartel wanted the investigation stopped. Your brother promised to handle it. That night, Will lay awake staring at the ceiling. The conspiracy was bigger than family betrayal. It involved organized crime, corruption at multiple levels, and a cover-up that had destroyed his life to protect others. But he was starting to see the shape of his enemy's plan, and for the first time since his arrest, Will Green smiled. Chapter 6. The Web Unravels. Will's legal situation seemed hopeless, but his real work was just beginning. Through carefully orchestrated conversations with Kurt Oliver, he began building a case that would destroy his enemies from within. The first breakthrough came when Oliver discovered that the FBI investigation into Will had been based entirely on anonymous tips and evidence provided by the sheriff's department. No independent investigation had been conducted. They'd simply trusted Gary Green's reputation and the planted evidence. The timeline doesn't work, Oliver explained during a clandestine meeting in the jail's chapel. The FBI received their first tip about you 6 weeks before the Farley case even went to trial. How could you be conspiring to help a client you hadn't even met yet? Well, I'd figured out that part already. Because I wasn't the original target. Gary was probably being investigated for corruption, and he needed a scapegoat. Who better than his own brother, the respected attorney? But the real revelation came when Oliver brought news about Melissa. She hadn't just betrayed Will. She'd been feeding information about him to someone else for months. I followed her after a book club meeting, Oliver said. She met with a man at the Riverside Motel. Middle-aged, expensive suit, definitely not from around here. Will's blood chilled as Oliver described the man. He matched the description of Adrian Simpson, a lawyer who worked for organized crime families in Chicago. Will had tangled with Simpson twice in federal cases and humiliated him both times. This isn't just about Gary's corruption, Will realized. Simpson is using my brother to get revenge on me while protecting his cartel clients. The pieces were falling into place. Simpson had identified Gary's vulnerability to corruption and exploited it. When Will's investigation into Farley threatened to expose the money laundering operation, Simpson activated his contingency plan. Melissa had been recruited as an inside source, probably seduced into believing she was helping expose Will's fictional crimes. Oliver's investigation revealed the true scope of the conspiracy. Gary had been taking payments from the cartel for 2 years, but he'd gotten sloppy. Will's reputation for thorough investigation made him a threat. If he dug deep enough into Farley's case, he might uncover the entire operation. But why frame you specifically? Oliver asked. Why not just transfer the case to another attorney? Well, I've been wondering the same thing until he remembered something from years ago. I testified against Simpson in a federal case 5 years ago. His client got 25 to life because of my testimony. Simpson swore he'd destroy me someday. The revenge was personal, but it was also practical. By framing Will, Simpson eliminated a threat to the cartel's operations and got his personal vengeance. Gary got to maintain his criminal income while looking like a hero for bringing down a corrupt attorney. Melissa probably believed she was on the side of justice. But they'd made one crucial mistake. They'd underestimated Will Green. As Oliver gathered more evidence, Will began planning phase 2 of his own operation. His enemies thought they'd destroyed him, but they'd only revealed themselves. And Will had learned something important during his years as a defense attorney. The best way to destroy a conspiracy is to turn the conspirators against each other. Kurt, he said quietly, I need you to make some calls for me. It's time to remind certain people that I wasn't just a lawyer. I was a very good lawyer. Chapter 7. The Counterattack. Will's revenge began with a single phone call that Kurt Oliver made to the Chicago field office of the FBI. The agent who answered was Elias Grady, a by-the-book investigator who'd worked with Will on several federal cases over the years. Agent Grady, this is Deputy Kurt Oliver from Cedar Falls. I have information about a federal conspiracy involving drug trafficking, money laundering, and corruption of law enforcement officials. Within 48 hours, Grady arrived in Cedar Falls with a full investigation team. Will had prepared for this moment, using his legal knowledge to craft a strategy that would systematically destroy his enemies. The first target was Adrian Simpson. Will had Oliver pass information to the FBI about Simpson's meetings with Melissa, along with financial records showing suspicious cash movements through local businesses, the same money laundering network that Louise Palmer had described. But Will's masterstroke was psychological. He had Oliver leak information to Palmer suggesting that someone in the cartel operation was cooperating with federal authorities. The paranoia spread quickly through the criminal network, creating suspicion and fear among the conspirators. Simpson, panicked about his exposure, made his first mistake. He contacted Gary directly from Chicago, ordering him to eliminate any remaining evidence. The call was traced and recorded by the FBI, establishing a direct connection between the corrupt sheriff and organized crime. Meanwhile, Will worked on turning Melissa. Through Oliver, he had evidence of her communications with Simpson delivered to her home, along with a simple note. Ask yourself why Simpson never mentioned his criminal record or his cartel connections. Melissa, who'd believed she was helping expose corruption, suddenly realized she'd been manipulated by actual criminals. Her world crumbled just as Will's had, but without the moral foundation to handle the revelation. She began drinking heavily and making desperate phone calls to Simpson, demanding explanations. Those calls led the FBI straight to Simpson's operation. Brian was the wild card in Will's plan. The boy had legally changed his name and was living with Melissa, believing his father was a criminal. Will knew that direct contact would backfire, so he chose a more subtle approach. He had Oliver leave evidence where Brian would find it. Not about Will's innocence, which the boy wouldn't believe, but about the dangerous people surrounding him. Photos of Simpson meeting with known cartel members. Records of Gary's suspicious finances. Most importantly, evidence that Melissa had been lying about Will's supposed crimes for months. Brian was 18, not stupid. When he started finding inconsistencies in the stories he'd been told, his natural intelligence led him to ask questions. Why had his father's corruption only come to light after he started defending Manuel Farley? Why were all the witnesses against his father connected to Sheriff Green's department? The final piece was Gary himself. Will knew his brother's weakness, pride and greed in equal measure. Through Oliver, Will leaked information suggesting that Simpson was planning to eliminate Gary once the heat died down. After all, a dead sheriff couldn't testify about cartel bribes. Gary, terrified and paranoid, made the fatal mistake of trying to cut his own deal with the FBI. Chapter 8. The Trap Springs. The confrontation Will had orchestrated came to a head on a cold November morning, exactly 6 weeks after his arrest. Agent Grady had been building his case systematically, following the breadcrumbs Will had laid through Oliver. Simpson made his first major error when he returned to Cedar Falls personally. He was panicked, knowing that the FBI was closing in and he needed to tie up loose ends. His meeting with Gary at an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of town was monitored by federal agents. We'll listen to the recording later, marveling at how quickly criminals turned on each other when survival was at stake. You promised me this would be clean. Simpson's voice was sharp with anger. You said your brother would be discredited and the investigation would die. I did what you asked, Gary replied, but there was fear in his voice. Will is in jail. His reputation is destroyed. And now the FBI is investigating me directly. They have financial records, communication intercepts. This is turning into a disaster. Maybe we should cut our losses. Our losses? Simpson's laugh was cold. Sheriff, you seem to have forgotten that I have enough evidence to send you to death row. You've been facilitating drug trafficking that's killed dozens of people in this state. The recording captured the sound of a gun being drawn. Here's what's going to happen, Simpson continued. You're going to eliminate the remaining threats. Your brother, the deputy who's been asking questions, anyone else who might connect us to this operation. You want me to kill Will. I want you to make it look like a jailhouse suicide. Man overcome with guilt kills himself before trial. Very tragic. But Gary Green, for all his corruption, wasn't a murderer. I can't. He's my brother. Then you're of no use to me. The gunshot echoed through the warehouse, but it wasn't Gary who fell. FBI snipers had been positioned around the building, and Simpson died before he could pull the trigger. Gary, faced with irrefutable evidence of the conspiracy against Will, finally broke down and confessed everything. Chapter 9. Justice Served. The truth, when it finally emerged, was even more damning than Will had imagined. Gary's confession revealed a corruption network that stretched across 3 counties and involved millions of dollars in drug money. Simpson had been the architect, using compromised law enforcement officials to protect cartel operations throughout the Midwest. Will's case was dismissed with prejudice, and Agent Grady personally delivered the news to his jail cell. I owe you an apology, Grady said, and probably a debt of gratitude. Your brother's operation was funding some of the most violent criminal organizations in the country. But Will's attention was focused on the personal betrayals that had cut him deepest. As he walked out of jail a free man, he found Brian waiting by the entrance. Dad, the boy said, tears streaming down his face. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry I didn't believe you. Will embraced his son, feeling a weight lift from his chest. You were manipulated by experts, Brian. Adults with decades of experience fell for their lies. I don't blame you for anything. Brian had legally changed his name back to Green and moved out of Melissa's house the moment he realized the truth. She tried to convince me you were dangerous even after the FBI cleared you. Said the evidence was fabricated to protect you. Melissa's downfall was perhaps the most complete. Faced with federal charges for conspiracy and evidence tampering, she tried to claim she was an innocent victim of Simpson's manipulation. But Will's careful evidence collection had documented her willing participation in the frame job. The recording devices Oliver had planted in her house, perfectly legal with an FBI warrant, captured her celebrating Will's arrest with Simpson. That arrogant bastard finally got what he deserved. Her voice was clear on the tape. 20 years I've been waiting to see Will Green brought down. 20 years. Will realized that Melissa's hatred went back to his first marriage, to some imagined slight or rejection that had festered into deadly obsession. She'd seduced him specifically to get close enough to destroy him. In court, facing 25 years in federal prison, Melissa finally showed her true face. You think you've won? She screamed at Will from the defendant's table. "You think this is over? I'll find a way to destroy you even from prison." But Will had learned something during his weeks of planning revenge. The most satisfying victory isn't destruction, it's justice. Melissa would spend the best years of her remaining life in federal prison. Simpson was dead. Gary faced life imprisonment for his role in multiple murders connected to the cartel operation. The final confrontation came at Gary's sentencing hearing. Will's brother, broken and facing the rest of his life behind bars, asked to speak privately with him. "I need you to know," Gary said quietly, "I never meant for it to go this far. When Simpson first approached me, it was just small favors. Looking the other way on some investigations. I thought I could control it. When did you decide to frame me?" Gary's voice broke. "When you started investigating Farley's case. Simpson said you'd uncover everything, that we'd both go down unless we acted first. He convinced me you'd understand, that you'd rather sacrifice yourself than see me destroyed." Will felt a strange mixture of pity and disgust for the brother he'd once loved. "You actually believed I'd want to take the fall for your crimes?" "I was desperate, Will. I owed them so much money, and they threatened to kill me if I didn't pay. So you decided to kill me instead, metaphorically speaking. I never wanted you to actually go to prison. Simpson said it would just be temporary, that the charges would be reduced once the heat died down." Will stood up, looking down at his brother. This weak, selfish man who'd thrown away everything for money and then tried to destroy the person who'd sacrificed everything to raise him. "Gary," he said quietly, "I spent weeks in jail planning elaborate revenge against you. I thought about destroying your life piece by piece, making you suffer the way you made me suffer." Gary looked up hopefully, "But then I realized something," Will continued. "You've already destroyed yourself more completely than I ever could. You lost your career, your freedom, your family, and your self-respect. There's nothing left of the brother I raised." Will walked toward the door, then paused. "The irony is if you'd just come to me when you got in trouble with the cartel, I would have helped you. I would have found a way to protect you, to get you out cleanly. That's what family does. Will, please. My brother died the day you decided to frame me for your crimes. You're just a stranger wearing his face." 3 months later, Will had rebuilt his law practice and was busier than ever. His experience as a wrongfully accused defendant had given him insights that made him an even more effective attorney. Brian had enrolled in pre-law at the state university, inspired by his father's fight for justice. The story became legend in legal circles. The attorney who solved his own case from jail and brought down a multi-state corruption network. But for Will, the real victory was simpler. He was sitting in his rebuilt office, reviewing case files, when Brian called. "Dad, I've been thinking about what happened, about how you planned everything so carefully, how you turned their own trap against them. It was brilliant." Will smiled, remembering the dark weeks when revenge had consumed his thoughts. "The best victories aren't about being brilliant, son. They're about being patient enough to let truth win. But you did get revenge. You destroyed everyone who betrayed you." "No," Will said quietly, looking out at the courthouse where justice had finally been served. "I didn't destroy them. I just gave them enough rope to hang themselves. In the end, that was the most perfect revenge of all, turning his enemies' own corruption and hatred against them, letting their true natures reveal themselves to the world." Will Green had learned that sometimes the best way to defeat evil is simply to refuse to become it yourself. The night he'd been arrested, he'd said nothing about who he really was. Now everyone knew. Will Green was exactly the man he'd always claimed to be, honorable, intelligent, and far more dangerous to criminals than they'd ever imagined. Justice, he reflected, had a beautiful symmetry when you had the patience to let it work. Epilogue. 5 years later. The morning sun cast long shadows across Will Green's new law office as he reviewed the case files spread across his mahogany desk. The brass nameplate read Green and Associates, though the Associates part was still more aspiration than reality. 5 years after his exoneration, Will had built something better than what he'd lost. A practice founded not just on legal expertise, but on hard-earned wisdom about corruption, betrayal, and the true meaning of justice. The phone rang, interrupting his review of a wrongful conviction case. "Green and Associates," he answered. "Mr. Green? This is Agent Patricia Roth from the FBI's Public Corruption Unit. I was hoping we could meet. We have a situation that requires someone with your unique experience." Will had fielded similar calls regularly over the past few years. His reputation as the lawyer who'd exposed a multi-state corruption network from inside a jail cell had made him a sought-after consultant for federal agencies. More importantly, his understanding of how corruption worked from the inside made him extraordinarily effective at dismantling it. "What's the situation, Agent Roth?" 3 judges in the state appellate system have been taking bribes for at least 5 years. "We have evidence, but we need someone who understands how to build an airtight case against legal professionals. These aren't street criminals. They know how to work the system." Will smiled grimly. "Corrupt officials are actually easier to catch than regular criminals. Their arrogance makes them sloppy. When can we meet?" After scheduling the meeting, Will returned to his files, but his mind wandered to the remarkable transformation his life had undergone. The wrongful imprisonment that had nearly destroyed him had instead revealed his true calling. He was no longer just a defense attorney. He was a specialist in exposing corruption and fighting for those who'd been betrayed by the very system meant to protect them. His client list read like a catalog of injustice. A police officer framed by his corrupt colleagues, a prosecutor who'd been set up for opposing organized crime, a judge who'd been blackmailed into making favorable rulings. Will had won every case, using the same methodical approach that had freed him from his own false charges. The financial rewards had been substantial, but that wasn't what drove him anymore. Each victory felt like vindication not just for his clients, but for the man he'd been before his arrest. The idealistic attorney who'd believed the system could work if good people fought hard enough to make it work. Brian walked into the office carrying 2 cups of coffee, his law school textbooks under his arm. At 23, he was in his final year at Northwestern and had already been accepted for internships at 3 prestigious firms. But Will suspected his son had other plans. "The Henderson case files came in," Brian said, setting down the coffee. "The prosecutor who was supposedly taking bribes?" "Dad, this looks exactly like what happened to you." Will nodded. Detective Marcus Henderson had been investigating a police corruption ring when someone planted evidence in his home and car. The frame job was sophisticated, professional, and remarkably similar to Will's own experience. "What do you think?" Will asked, curious about his son's analysis. Brian had spent 5 years watching his father work, learning not just legal technique, but investigative methodology. His insights were often sharper than those of experienced attorneys. "The timing is wrong," Brian said immediately. Henderson was supposedly taking bribes from a drug dealer he arrested 6 months ago. But the financial evidence shows deposits starting 8 months ago, 2 months before he even knew the dealer existed. Good catch. What else? The planted evidence was too convenient. Marked bills in his garage, exactly the amount that was supposedly paid in bribes. Real corruption is messier, more subtle. Brian paused, studying the files. Someone wanted Henderson gone fast. Something he was investigating posed an immediate threat. Will felt a surge of pride. Brian had developed the same instinct for uncovering truth that had served Will throughout his career. More importantly, his son had found his calling in seeking justice for those who'd been wronged. "I want to help with this case," Brian said quietly. "Not just research. I want to be involved in the investigation. You have 6 months left of law school. Dad, I've learned more working with you these past 3 years than I ever could in a classroom. Besides," Brian grinned, "I have personal experience with being betrayed by family. That gives me insight other lawyers don't have." Will studied his son carefully. The boy had grown into a man of remarkable character, shaped by adversity into someone who understood both the power of truth and the cost of betrayal. "All right, but we do this my way, methodical, careful, and absolutely by the book. Wouldn't have it any other way." Their conversation was interrupted by Kurt Oliver, who'd become Will's primary investigator after leaving the sheriff's department. Kurt had paid a price for his loyalty to Will. He'd been ostracized by many in local law enforcement and had struggled to find work until Will hired him. "I have news about our old friends," Kurt said, settling into the chair across from Will's desk. Melissa was denied parole again yesterday. The board cited lack of genuine remorse and continued attempts to manipulate the system. Will felt nothing at the news. Not satisfaction, not pity, just a distant acknowledgement that justice continued to run its course. Melissa had spent 5 years in federal prison, but according to Kurt's sources, she'd used that time poorly. Instead of accepting responsibility, she'd doubled down on her claims of innocence and had been caught multiple times trying to orchestrate revenge plots against Will from behind bars. She's been telling other inmates that she's the real victim, Kurt continued. Claims you seduced her specifically to frame her for crimes you committed. The psychology reports describe her as having severe narcissistic personality disorder with sociopathic tendencies. Brian shook his head in amazement. Even now, she can't admit she was wrong. Some people can't, Will said. Their entire identity is built on being the hero of their own story. Accepting responsibility would mean acknowledging that they're the villain instead. Kurt had more updates. Adrian Simpson's death had unraveled a corruption network spanning 7 states. Federal prosecutors were still filing charges against officials who'd taken bribes from his operation. The cartel connection had led to dozens of arrests and significantly disrupted drug trafficking throughout the Midwest. The most interesting development is in Chicago, Kurt said. Simpson's law firm is being disbanded under federal racketeering statutes. 3 of his partners are facing charges, and the FBI seized over $15 million in assets. Will had mixed feelings about Simpson's death. The man had orchestrated the destruction of Will's life for personal revenge, but he died quickly while his victims had suffered for months or years. Still, Simpson's death had prevented him from escaping justice through legal technicalities, and his criminal empire had collapsed completely. What about Gary? Brian asked quietly. Kurt's expression darkened. That's complicated. Will's brother had cooperated fully with federal authorities, providing evidence that had led to convictions in dozens of cases. His testimony had been crucial in dismantling the cartel's law enforcement network. In exchange, he'd received a 20-year sentence instead of life imprisonment. He's been asking to see you, Kurt said. His lawyer says he wants to apologize to try to make amends. Will had refused all contact with Gary for 5 years. Part of him felt obligated to visit. After all, he'd raised Gary from the age of 13, and some vestige of brotherly love remained. But a larger part of him recognized that Gary's desire for reconciliation was probably just another form of manipulation. Has he shown any genuine remorse? Will asked. According to the prison psychologist, yes. He's been a model prisoner, helps other inmates with their legal issues, teaches literacy classes. But Kurt hesitated. But what? He's also been telling people that you orchestrated his downfall. Not that you were innocent. He admits that. But that you deliberately trapped him and Simpson as revenge. Will felt a familiar cold anger. Even in prison, facing the consequences of his own choices, Gary couldn't accept full responsibility. He had to make himself the victim of his brother's superior planning. Dad, Brian said carefully, maybe that's not entirely wrong. Will and Kurt both looked at him sharply. I mean, you were innocent of the original charges, Brian continued. But once you figured out what was happening, you absolutely did set traps for them. You manipulated Oliver into investigating Gary. You fed information to the FBI knowing it would lead to Simpson. You psychologically pressured Melissa into making incriminating phone calls. Are you saying I was wrong to do that? No, I'm saying you were brilliant. But Gary isn't entirely wrong about being outmaneuvered. Brian smiled. The difference is he deserved it. We'll consider this perspective. His plan had been elaborate and carefully executed, designed to turn his enemies' own corruption against them. He'd used their guilt, paranoia, and arrogance as weapons, manipulating them into destroying themselves. In a sense, Gary was right. Will had orchestrated their downfall. But unlike his brother's corruption, Will's revenge had served justice rather than personal gain. The afternoon brought a visitor Will hadn't expected, Judge Christian Cameron, who'd presided over Will's arraignment 5 years earlier. Cameron was now retired, but he'd requested a private meeting to discuss something he called a matter of conscience. I owe you an apology, Cameron said without preamble. I believe the evidence against you without question. I set your bail impossibly high because I was disgusted by what I thought you'd done. Your Honor, you did your job based on the evidence presented. No, Will. I did my job badly. Cameron's voice was heavy with regret. I'd known you professionally for 15 years. I'd seen your character, your integrity, your dedication to justice. I should have questioned evidence that seemed so contrary to everything I knew about you. Will poured the judge a cup of coffee, studying the older man's weathered face. What's really troubling you? Cameron sighed deeply. I've been reviewing cases from the past 10 years, looking for patterns. Your case made me paranoid about planted evidence and corrupted investigations. I found at least 12 other cases where the evidence seemed too convenient, too perfectly damning. 12 cases of wrongful conviction, possibly more. Will, I think Simpson's operation was bigger than anyone realized. I think they've been framing people for years, and I helped send innocent people to prison. This revelation hit Will like a physical blow. His own case hadn't been an isolated incident. It had been part of a systematic campaign to eliminate threats to organized crime operations. I need your help, Cameron continued. I need someone who understands how these frame jobs work, someone who can identify the patterns and help me get these convictions overturned. Will felt the familiar surge of purpose that had driven him since his exoneration. Judge, I think you've just given my practice a new mission. Over the following months, Will and Brian worked with Cameron to identify potential victims of Simpson's network. The work was painstaking, requiring them to review thousands of case files and identify suspicious patterns in evidence and prosecution. They found a mechanic who'd been framed for auto theft because he'd witnessed drug transactions at a shop used for money laundering. An accountant who'd been convicted of tax fraud after discovering irregularities in a client's books. A client who turned out to be a cartel front business. A journalist who'd been charged with bribery after investigating police corruption. Each case followed the same pattern. Sophisticated evidence planting, key witnesses who were later revealed to be compromised, and investigations that moved too quickly to allow for thorough defense preparation. It's like an assembly line for wrongful convictions, Brian observed after they had identified the 15th case. They had the system perfected. Will had begun filing appeals and bringing federal attention to the pattern of corruption. 3 convictions had already been overturned, and the FBI had opened a task force specifically to investigate Simpson's legacy cases. The personal cost of this work was significant. Will was often reminded of his own darkest period, reliving the helplessness and betrayal he'd felt. But he'd also found something he'd never had before his arrest, a clear understanding of his purpose in life. You know what's ironic? Brian said one evening as they worked late in the office. If Gary and Melissa and Simpson hadn't betrayed you, you never would have discovered your true calling. Will looked up from a file he was reviewing, a case involving a single mother who'd been framed for drug trafficking to prevent her from testifying against corrupt police officers. That's a dangerous way of thinking, Will replied. It suggests that suffering is justified if it leads to good outcomes. I'd rather have lived my quiet life as a small-town attorney if it meant these other innocent people were never wrongfully convicted. But you couldn't have helped them if you hadn't experienced it yourself. True, but I would have chosen a different path to wisdom if I'd had the choice. Their conversation was interrupted by a call from Agent Grady, who'd become a close friend over the years of working together on corruption cases. Will, we have a problem. A big one. What kind of problem? The kind that involves you personally. We've been monitoring communications from the federal prison where Melissa Dudley is incarcerated. She's been in contact with associates of Simpson's Chicago operation, people who weren't arrested in the original sweep. Will felt a chill. What kind of contact? She's been providing them with detailed information about your new practice, your clients, your daily routines. We think they're planning some kind of retaliation. This development forced Will to confront an uncomfortable truth. His victory over his enemies hadn't ended the threat they represented. Simpson's death had created a power vacuum in his criminal organization, and someone had decided that eliminating Will Green was necessary for the group's survival. How serious is the threat? Brian asked when Will explained the situation. Serious enough that Agent Grady wants us to consider witness protection. Are we going to do it? Will looked at his son, this young man who'd been shaped by betrayal into someone strong enough to stand with his father against any threat. No, Will said firmly. We're not running from criminals. We're going to do what we do best. We're going to expose them and let the justice system handle the rest. The investigation into the new threat revealed the scope of Simpson's legacy. His criminal organization hadn't died with him. It had simply reorganized under new leadership. The new boss was someone Will had never heard of, Dwight Peck, a former federal prosecutor who'd been secretly working for organized crime for over a decade. Peck was Simpson's inside man in the Justice Department. Agent Grady explained during a secure briefing. He's the one who made sure federal investigations into cartel operations got misdirected or delayed. Simpson's death exposed him, and now he's desperate to eliminate anyone who could connect him to the conspiracy. The threat was real and immediate. Peck had resources, connections, and a knowledge of federal law enforcement procedures that made him extraordinarily dangerous. But he'd also made a crucial error. He'd underestimated Will Green's ability to turn defensive situations into offensive opportunities. Working with the FBI, Will developed a strategy that was both complex and elegantly simple. Instead of hiding from Peck's organization, he would draw them into the open by making himself an irresistible target. You want to use yourself as bait, Agent Grady said incredulously. Will, these people have killed federal agents. This isn't like your brother and Melissa. These are professional assassins. Which is why they won't expect me to come after them directly, Will replied. They think I'm a small-town lawyer who got lucky once. They have no idea what I'm actually capable of. The plan Will devised was a masterpiece of legal and psychological warfare. He began taking cases that would naturally bring him in a conflict with Peck's network, defending clients who'd been framed by corrupt federal prosecutors, representing witnesses who'd been intimidated into silence, exposing cover-ups that protected organized crime operations. Each case was carefully chosen to apply pressure to Peck's organization while building an evidentiary foundation for federal prosecution. Will was essentially conducting a shadow investigation, using his legal practice as cover for gathering intelligence on criminal conspiracies. Brian, now a recent law school graduate, proved invaluable to the operation. His youth and relative anonymity allowed him to make contacts and gather information that would have been impossible for Will. I found something interesting, Brian said one evening, returning from a meeting with a potential client. Remember the Manuel Farley case, the insurance fraud that started everything? Of course, Farley wasn't just innocent of the charges against him. He was investigating the insurance fraud himself, trying to prove that someone in his own company was running a scam. The real perpetrator was the company's vice president, Alan Rivas. Will looked up sharply. I remember Rivas. He testified against Farley. Right. And according to Farley, Rivas had connections to organized crime. He was laundering money through fraudulent insurance claims. Brian spread documents across the desk. Dad, I think Farley's investigation was getting close to exposing Peck's operation. That's why they needed him discredited and you eliminated. This revelation reframed everything Will thought he knew about his own case. He hadn't been targeted because of his defense of Farley. He'd been targeted because his investigation into Farley's innocence was leading him toward a much larger criminal conspiracy. How many people did they frame or kill to protect this operation? Brian asked quietly. We may never know the full scope, Will replied, but we're going to make sure it stops here. The final confrontation came sooner than expected. Peck, growing desperate as federal pressure intensified, decided on a direct approach. Instead of having Will assassinated, he attempted something more sophisticated. Another frame job designed to discredit Will's anti-corruption work and eliminate him as a threat. The plan was discovered when Kurt Oliver, now Will's full-time investigator, noticed suspicious activity around Will's office and home. Electronic surveillance, people following Brian, inquiries about Will's financial record from fake federal agents. They're setting up another elaborate frame, Kurt reported. But this time, we're ready for them. Will's counterplan was audacious. Instead of simply avoiding Peck's trap, He would spring it prematurely while documenting everything for federal prosecutors. The key was making Peck's people believe they were succeeding while actually recording their criminal activities. Working with the FBI, Will allowed fake evidence to be planted in his office, while hidden cameras captured every moment. He permitted his communications to be monitored while federal agents recorded the surveillance. Most importantly, he let Peck's organization believe they were manipulating him while he systematically gathered evidence of their crimes. The trap was sprung on a Tuesday morning when Peck's associates attempted to arrest Will on fabricated federal charges. What they didn't know was that the federal agents were actually undercover FBI operatives, and every aspect of the attempted frame job was being recorded in high definition. Peck himself was arrested that afternoon, caught on tape directing the fabrication of evidence against Will. His organization collapsed within hours as federal agents executed simultaneous raids across 7 states. In the aftermath, Will found himself reflecting on the strange arc his life had taken. The betrayal that had nearly destroyed him had ultimately revealed his true purpose. Not just practicing law, but using law as a weapon against corruption and injustice. "Do you ever regret it?" Brian asked one evening as they worked late in the office. Fighting instead of just rebuilding quietly? Will considered the question seriously. His life was undoubtedly more dangerous now, more complicated. He'd made powerful enemies and would probably spend the rest of his career looking over his shoulder. "No," he said finally. "I could have taken a quiet job at a small firm, kept my head down, lived safely. But every time I see another innocent person being destroyed by corruption, I remember how helpless I felt in that jail cell. If I have the power to prevent that feeling for someone else, then I have the obligation to use it." Brian nodded, understanding. His own life had been shaped by the same realization, that those with the ability to fight injustice had the responsibility to do so, regardless of personal cost. The years that followed established Will Green as the nation's foremost expert on exposing corruption within legal and law enforcement systems. His practice grew to include associates in 5 states, all specializing in wrongful conviction cases and public corruption defense. Brian passed the bar exam with distinction and immediately joined his father's practice. Their first case together involved exposing a federal judge who'd been fixing cases for organized crime, an investigation that led to the largest judicial corruption scandal in decades. The Green Method, as legal scholars began calling it, became required study at law schools across the country. The approach combined traditional legal research with investigative techniques, psychological manipulation of suspects, and strategic use of media pressure to expose corruption. More personally, Will had found something he'd lost during his marriage to Sarah and thought he'd found again with Melissa: genuine love. Dr. Aaron Green, a forensic psychologist who'd worked on several of his cases, had gradually become his closest friend and eventually his partner. Unlike his previous relationships, this one was built on shared professional respect and complete honesty about their pasts. "I know what you're capable of when you're betrayed," Aaron told him during one of their late-night conversations. "That doesn't scare me. It makes me trust you more. Someone who survived what you've survived and remained capable of love is someone worth loving." They'd married quietly 2 years after Peck's arrest, with Brian as Will's best man and Kurt as the officiant. It was a small ceremony, attended only by people who'd proven their loyalty through adversity. The contrast with Will's first engagement to Melissa couldn't have been starker. Where Melissa had been secretive about her past and evasive about her motivations, Aaron was completely transparent. Where Melissa had isolated Will from potential allies, Aaron encouraged his friendships and professional relationships. "The difference," Will explain to Brian, "is that Aaron wants me to succeed. Melissa wanted to control me. As for the others who'd betrayed him, justice had taken its course with surgical precision. Melissa remained in federal prison, her appeals exhausted and her reputation destroyed. She'd become a cautionary tale in legal circles, the librarian who'd seduced a prominent attorney as part of an elaborate criminal conspiracy. Her attempts to profit from her story through book deals and interviews had failed when publishers realized she remained unrepentant and was likely lying about key facts. Gary had served 7 years of his sentence and had become genuinely remorseful, according to prison officials. He'd earned a degree in social work and had been working with at-risk youth, trying to prevent others from making the choices that had destroyed his life. Will had finally agreed to visit him the previous Christmas. The meeting had been awkward, but necessary. Gary, now 42 and prematurely aged by prison life, had broken down completely when he saw his brother. "I know I don't deserve forgiveness," Gary had said through tears. "I know what I did was unforgivable, but I need you to know that I understand now. I was weak, and I let that weakness hurt the person who meant the most to me." Will had felt no satisfaction in his brother's suffering, only a deep sadness for the man Gary might have been under different circumstances. "I forgive you," Will had said quietly. "Not because you deserve it, but because holding on to anger has no purpose anymore." It was true. Will had learned that revenge was most satisfying when it served justice, and justice had been served. His enemies had been defeated not through violence or cruelty, but through their own corruption being exposed to the light. The conversation with Gary had provided unexpected closure. Will realized that his brother's betrayal, while personally devastating, had ultimately saved both their lives. If Will hadn't been framed, he never would have discovered the depth of Gary's corruption or Simpson's criminal network. Gary would have remained trapped in an increasingly dangerous situation until the cartel eventually killed him to protect their secrets. "Maybe suffering does serve a purpose sometimes," Will admitted to Brian later. "Not because it's deserved, but because it forces us to become who we're meant to be." Brian was now handling cases independently, having developed his own reputation as a skilled investigator of government corruption. At 25, he was already being courted by federal agencies and prestigious law firms. But he'd chosen to stay with his father's practice, drawn by the meaningful work of fighting for justice. "I've been thinking about starting a foundation," Brian told Will one evening as they wrapped up work on a case involving corrupt prosecutors in Texas. "Something that provides legal representation for people who can't afford to fight wrongful charges." Will smiled, remembering his own idealistic dreams before life had tested them so severely. "That's a good idea. What would you call it?" "The Sarah Green Foundation for Legal Justice," Brian said. "After Mom. She always believed that law should protect the innocent, not just serve the powerful." The idea moved Will deeply. His late wife's name attached to work that carried forward everything she believed in. It felt like redemption not just for his own suffering, but for the pain his family had endured. "I think that's perfect," Will said, "and I know exactly how to fund it." The civil lawsuit against Simpson's estate and his co-conspirators had resulted in a $38 million settlement. Will had used part of the money to rebuild his practice and ensure financial security for his family. The rest, over $25 million, would provide the foundation's endowment. As they worked together to establish the foundation, Will reflected on the unexpected gifts that had emerged from his ordeal. His relationship with Brian was stronger than ever, built on mutual respect and shared purpose. His marriage to Erin was deeper and more honest than any relationship he'd experienced. His professional life had meaning beyond personal success. Most importantly, he learned something about justice that no law school could have taught him. True justice wasn't about punishment. It was about restoration, restoring innocent people to freedom, restoring faith in legal institutions, restoring the balance between those who serve the law and those who try to corrupt it. The final validation came 5 years after Peck's arrest, when Will received an unexpected visitor. Manuel Farley, the man whose case had started everything, came to the office with news that brought the story full circle. "Mr. Green," Farley said, his voice emotional, "I wanted to thank you personally, not just for defending me, but for everything that came after. I'm not sure I understand. The investigation that cleared your name also exposed the insurance fraud network that had been operating for years. 23 people who'd been falsely accused or wrongfully convicted have been exonerated. The company I worked for has paid out over $60 million in settlements to victims." Farley paused, gathering his composure. "But more than that, your case changed how the FBI investigates corruption. The procedures they developed, while working with you have exposed criminal networks in 12 states. You didn't just clear your own name. You created a system that's protecting innocent people across the country. Will felt a profound sense of completion. The betrayal that had nearly destroyed him had ultimately led to a legacy of protection for others who faced similar injustice. That evening, Will stood in his office looking out at the courthouse where his nightmare had begun. The building looked the same, but everything else had changed. Where once he'd felt betrayed and alone, he now felt surrounded by allies committed to the same cause. Where once he'd trusted blindly, he now trusted wisely. Where once he'd been naive about the depth of human corruption, he now understood both its power and its weaknesses. Brian joined him at the window, now a partner in the practice and co-founder of the foundation that bore his mother's name. Any regrets? Brian asked. Will thought about Melissa rotting in federal prison, still convinced she was the victim. He thought about Gary, genuinely reformed, but serving the consequences of his choices. He thought about Simpson, dead before he could face justice for all his crimes. He thought about Peck and the dozens of other corrupt officials whose careers and lives had been destroyed when their corruption was exposed. No, Will said finally, I wouldn't change anything. Even the betrayal, even the jail time. It all led here, to this moment, to this work. I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be. As father and son continued their work into the night, Will reflected on the most important lesson his ordeal had taught him. That sometimes the greatest victories come not from avoiding suffering, but from transforming it into purpose. His enemies had tried to destroy him, but instead they'd forged him into something stronger, a weapon against the very corruption they represented. The night he was arrested, Will Green had said nothing about who he really was. Now, 5 years later, the whole world knew. He was a man who could not be broken, could not be corrupted, and could not be stopped from seeking justice for those who had no other champion. That knowledge, more than any revenge he could have planned, was the sweetest victory of all. And there you have it. Another story comes to an end. What did you think? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoy this story, consider joining our community by subscribing. It means the world to us. For more stories like this one, check out the recommended videos on screen, and I'll see you there.